Thank you so much for joining me for this incredibly important conversation. My name is Sylvia Albert, and I'm the Director of Voting and Elections at Common Cause. I will be joined with a distinguished panel to discuss how we can protect the right to vote. Before I start, I'd just like to set the stage for where we are. In 2020, we saw record turnout. People came through a pandemic to have their voices heard. But since then, we've seen a rash of bills at the state level, continued questioning of the results of the election, and as a result, a lack of confidence by the American people in that election result and in our democracy. We're going to be talking to our colleagues about where we go next. I will introduce each of them in turn and allow them to give us a few thoughts before we turn to further discussion. So to begin, we are joined by Nsé Ufo, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the New Georgia Project and its affiliate, New Georgia Project Action Fund. Nsé leads both organizations, and they are developing Georgia's homegrown talent by training and organizing local activists across the state and making a true difference in voting on the ground. Nsé.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. They often say that it's darkest before dawn. And so when I start to think about where we stand as it relates to democratic participation and electoral participation in American politics, it feels like 3:45 in the morning. It feels like we are in a really, really dark place. But I'm also really encouraged by the clarity that has come from leaders all across our country, but most importantly from citizens, from ordinary Americans, from voters. I remember that when during my first election, the dominant narrative was who was the guy you would most likely to have, you'd most want to have a beer with. I'm happy to say that those conversations don't happen at all, not in the world of the New Georgia Project and the work that we do and the voter education work that we do. Not only is it not gendered in that way, but again, it is less about a personality and much, much more about what is it that you are going to do? Are you going to go to Washington, D.C.? Are you going to go to your state capital to do the people's work? So that is our North Star. That is the kind of democracy that we are actively building right now. That has led us to some really big wins in the Deep South. And that is what makes me hopeful for the future of our democracy.
Thank you so much, Nsé. Next, we have Maria Tereza Kumar, who is the founding CEO of Vote Latino and Vote Latino Foundation and an Emmy-nominated on-air analyst for MSNBC. Voto Latino is the largest Latin voter registration and mobilization organization and has been a major voice recently in countering disinformation in the Latino community. Maria Tereza.
Well, first of all, thank you for having this timely discussion. I think that we are all in the throes of recognizing that we need to pass massive legislation so that we can continue to safeguard little d democracy. So I am grateful and honored to be in community with the New Georgia Project. Nsé and I have been on the other side when we were trying to get electoral work together. Trey, it's wonderful to be here with you as well, because I know that you're an advocate for democracy, regardless of political stripes. And that's where we are today, Sylvia, where we have to take a step back. And it's been very clear that their current citizens want to participate in their elections. Since 2018 was the largest participation of Americans in the midterm election in 100 years. And we topped our participation in 2020. We had a fair, certified election last year. And it was the most diverse group of Americans across generations and colors, creeds, and hues. And what we're seeing is that participation being penalized, because there is no doubt that all 50 states certified elections, and they were certified by Republicans and Democrats, independents who helped make the count. And instead of continuing to enfranchise individuals, passing the Freedom to Vote Act to ensure that everybody, regardless of zip code or color or creed, can equally access their voting booth, we have a set of individuals hell-bent on ensuring that we don't have maximum participation. And regardless of political stripes, I have to share with you, every single American should take umbrage with that. We should be offended because the underpinnings of our democracy, what our Constitution believes in, what we believe in as Americans, is equal enfranchisement at the voting booth. There was no shenanigans last election. That's been proven. And instead of going on that course of what did we do so well that we had such great participation, we now have individuals at the state level trying to disenfranchise millions of Americans who are disproportionately young and disproportionately people of color. And I say this because in a place, for example, like Texas, where we have seen close to 2 million people added in the last decade, 95% of them who are people of color, the state was granted as a result 2 congressional seats because of that rise of a young, diverse population. And the state legislature decided, instead of fairly carving out representation and allocation of resources, because that's what happens with redistricting, they decided instead to create a map that was heavily leaning of one political agenda and disproportionately white. And it's those shenanigans that makes people erode trust that the system works. And so I am grateful to be here because I can tell you Voto Latino is actively suing Texas, not thrice, but we're going to go on our 4th lawsuit in less than 7 months. That's not the business that we do. Our business is generally just to convince people that registering is good, that democracy works for them, and that they have to participate. But we find ourselves in another place because it's a concerted effort to ensure that not everyone has equal voice. And so I really am grateful to have this conversation now, because the more Americans learn of what is happening, the more we need them to get involved, to call their members of Congress, the senators, and say, this does not actually heed the promise of the American dream. And that is, as President Biden said the other day, that voting is the threshold of democracy.
Well said. Thank you, Maria Tereza. And last but not least, we are joined by Trey Grayson, who is a member of the Kentucky office of Frost Brown Todd and managing director of the firm's government relations affiliate Civic Point. Trey served as a 2-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky and currently serves as a board member of the Center for Election Innovation and Research and works with additional groups and organizations to create a secure and modern election system. Trey.
Thanks, Sylvia, and it's great to be with my fellow panelists. I'm happy to be the closer here for our introductions. I want to offer a bit of an election administrator's perspective, because that was my background from my time as Secretary of State. And I still spend a lot of time helping election administrators do their jobs better, defending them in the press, and also helping them to educate policymakers about the kind of laws we need to help run our elections better. And I think back to the almost 2 decades that I've been around this election space in a formal way. I got elected in 2003 and started running in 2002 for Secretary of State. And let me start with some positives. Our elections work so much better today than they did 20 years ago. We have seen an increase in technology, an increase in security. More Americans have the ability to choose how they want to vote. Do they want to vote on election day, as was tradition? Do they want to vote by mail? Or do they want to vote in person, but early, in advance of election day? More Americans than ever before have been able to do that. We have this technology has allowed us to do things like risk limiting audits that we're starting to roll out across the country so we can have confidence in our elections. It's also enabled states to have, this is kind of crazy to think, but 20 years ago, we didn't have very many states that even had a statewide voter registration list. It was county by county. And so it was rife with errors and full of people who were disenfranchised inadvertently or perhaps even intentionally by some bureaucrats or lawmakers who wanted to disenfranchise. So on the arc of history, I just want to point out, and sometimes it's a little bit of a contrary voice in these audiences, but we're doing a lot better. And even if I look over the last couple of years where we survived, we had record turnout in the middle of a pandemic. we saw many states adapt their elections accordingly because they knew they couldn't do it as normal. And there were a lot of groups and individuals, even businesses, that helped. I mean, I think back to the states that engaged the beer industry to help disseminate messages on new ways to vote and how to get an absentee ballot for folks who maybe usually were election day voters, but needed to vote in advance of election day. Now, unfortunately, over the last couple of years, we've seen, and my other panelists have alluded to this fact, or Steve actually stated it, the President Trump and the fallout from the 2020 election, and the continued belief by too many people in my party that the election was rigged or something was wrong, when lawsuit after lawsuit, investigation, audit, recount, whatever you want to call it, President Biden won fair and square. Was it a perfect election? No. It was clear who the winner is. We installed the right person on January 20th. This continued lie and the pressure on election administrators has unfortunately continued to build. You know, there wasn't an off year for election administrators last year. They were defending their records. We've seen folks in say the state of Georgia, we've seen a couple of folks who got so bad they had to sue for defamation because they're feared for their lives just for doing their jobs. So there's a lot of stress on the system. There's a lot of stress on election administrators. And we need to come back together as a country and stop arguing about election administration. Let's count the votes, let's follow the laws, and let's celebrate the winners, no matter whether they were the people that we supported or not, but celebrate the system. But I just wanted to point out the fact that over the last couple of decades, it has gotten better. And that gives me some confidence that we can get through these rough couple of years that we've had. And I think we're probably going to continue to have leading up to the 2024 election.
Thank you, Trey. As you've pointed out, we've had a rough couple of years. We have come a long way, but there can be backsliding, and it feels that is what's happening right now. So I'm going to start you guys out with what I consider the hardest question, which is, what is the biggest threat to democracy in the 2022 elections? That is not an easy question, I think, because there are a plethora of different issues that we are attacking and trying to get past. So I will start with Ense.
This is a difficult question to answer, but for me right now, it's misinformation and disinformation. When I think about the populations, the communities that we organize with, we're talking about young people, right? So 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are desperately seeking information of how to evaluate candidates, when to vote, what are the different ways that they can vote. I think new Americans, right? Recently naturalized citizens, we are well known for showing up at naturalization ceremonies with like miniature apple pies and voter registration forms, right? And so thinking about, again, people who are eager to get information about candidates and information that they can rely on, information that they can base decisions on, and to think that they're actively being sort of organized against by well-resourced bad actors. And we used to joke that it was like, if one of our organizers or a community member would bring to us like a flyer that had the wrong election date, and we'd be like, well, is it the Russians or the Republicans, right? And the truth of the matter is that it doesn't matter that whether or not the bad actors are foreign or domestic, that young people and people of color and new Americans are targets for these bad actors, the places where we get information online, the papers, radio, television, et cetera. And we have leaders that refuse to acknowledge that. And I think part of it is because they themselves don't know how to combat it. And so I think we don't have great sophisticated ways to push back against it. It's really easy to just spread lies and just keep repeating that lie over and over again. And if it is designed to sort of speak to that visceral thing that all of us have, then coming back with sober, fact-based messages is not competing amongst the fiery passion of a big old juicy lie that's designed to inspire a particular type of action. And so I think that one of the reasons why it's challenging, or the most pressing thing that I'm concerned about, is because it's a nation destabilizing tactic that we have seen being executed successfully throughout the history of the world and all over the world, and B, that with the element of, with the introduction of, or the advancement of technology and social media, that the platforms are changing and evolving so quickly that those of us who are advocates and activists and thinking about how to make sure that we inject high quality information that people can rely on to make decisions sometimes have to learn the technology itself, right? So, if these different disinformation campaigns are happening on Snapchat, right, or on TikTok or some platform that, elected officials, senior journalists, newsroom editors, et cetera. If you're not familiar with the platform, you don't even know that it exists. You don't have an account. How can you get there to neutralize the impact of these attempts to influence our elections and poison the information well? So we're working really hard to get smart about it, but sometimes it feels like we're constantly playing catch up, and I'm deeply concerned about it.
Thank you, Ense. Yes, I will also date myself by saying I remember my first election working and getting those flyers of Democrats vote Wednesday, Republicans vote Tuesday, or the opposite, and thinking, well, how many people could they really have hit with these flyers? And we're in a whole new world now. It's huge. As Ense discussed, we know that disinformation is a major threat, and we know it will continue to be a threat going into the 2022 election. We also know that it is highly targeted in the Latino population. So Maria Tereza, for the 2022 election going forward, what do you see as the biggest threat?
I think that what we're going to have to tackle as a democracy and as citizens of the country is twofold. I believe that there are two threats to our democracy as it stands. One is absolutely the disinformation, misinformation that oftentimes starts in the Latino community, but then spreads into the wider population. Think of the Latino community receiving disinformation as the canaries in the coal mine, that whatever seems to stick is then translated into English and goes mainstream and at scale. So one thing that Voto Latino did to help prevent the spread of disinformation in 2020, for example, is that we went from 10 celebrity influencers in 2016 to helping identify, training, and mobilizing and organizing 267 voices, individuals that had Instagram accounts as small as 3,000 to Selena Gomez, who had 62 million, because we knew that with the right information by trusted sources, by trusted brands, that the Latino community would step up and do what they needed to do. And in this case, it was to vote. However, we have not seen that subside at all. If anything, we have seen it go much quicker and growing. It is one of the cancers that I would say is happening right now in the social platform spaces, and they're not addressing it in the way that they should. I think one of the challenges is that oftentimes they will take down disinformation and misinformation that is in English, but they will let the Spanish language piece spread. We saw that very much with COVID disinformation, misinformation, and it was stuff that we flagged not only for for Facebook, but we also flagged it for Google. We also flagged it for the administration, but we shouldn't be the ones flagging it. They have an incredible apparatus at their fingertips, and there needs to be much more accountability on that regard. But disinformation, the purpose of disinformation and misinformation is old style propaganda trying to create distrust in the institutions that govern you, full stop. And so if you are a new voter or a person of color voter, or increasingly, sadly, individuals that are coming from the extreme right that are reading this disinformation saying that the government is trying to harm you, it has all the same corrosive effect of our democracy. And so disinformation, misinformation is absolutely one of the issues that are concerning to us and to me personally at Voto Latino. And then there's the other side. And that other pillar of this, of what concerns me, is the disenfranchisement of millions of Americans without not being able to access the vote. This is an orchestrated effort. It's coming not from the ground up from grassroots organizations in states like Georgia or Arizona or Texas. Instead, they're coming from a concerted effort from Washington, D.C. There's been documented that the Heritage Foundation has paid and promoted and gone door to door, so to speak, in these state houses, promoting a bill in a box. And it is something that, again, should concern all of us. If I was a Georgian and someone coming outside of my state is trying to perpetuate disenfranchisement laws, regardless of political parties, I would be upset, and rightfully so. And so we need to figure out how to create a modernized election system and a modernized rules of the game for federal elections across the board. And so my hope is that Congress passes the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act soon. And it shouldn't be a Democratic or Republican issue. This is really a time to be American patriots and do something right and help make sure that every person has the ability to cast a ballot regardless of party. Something that really stuck with me was listening to Vice President Kamala Harris when she spoke in Atlanta at Morehouse the other day. And she was very clear that unless we figure out how to modernize our election systems for federal elections, there's not one American, regardless of political stripes, that's not going to be adversely impacted. And I couldn't disagree, I couldn't agree more. And we should really make sure that, again, we fortify our election systems right now, that we create very clear modern election laws so that everybody's playing by the same rules. And we tackle very seriously the misinformation, disinformation, whose only charge is to create chaos and disruption in faith in our institutions.
Thank you, Maria Tereza. Trey, you spoke earlier about how far we have come and how our election system is so much better than it used to be. Even given that, what do you see as the biggest threat to democracy in the 2022 election?
As I was listening to the two preceding answers, I agree on the importance and the risks for misinformation, disinformation. It's a real problem. I think what I would add is just the strain, and I hate to, I realize I'm doing the election administrator hat thing again, but the strain on our folks who run the election in a couple of different ways. I mentioned the sort of the public stress, but also candidates not accepting outcomes, and then sort of the never-ending nature of there's an election, you conduct an election, you have a count, you have a certification, and then you pivot to figuring out how do you make your election better for next time. And we haven't really had a chance to do that because of never-ending audits and never-ending stress and never-ending pressure. And so I'm worried that we're going to see the impact of retirements this year of a lot of election administrators, where we have some green folks who aren't as familiar with how the systems ought to work, and that could create some challenges on election day, that we're going to see more retirements after the election, as folks maybe, in our state, we have a lot of county clerks who just are not wanting to run for re-election. This is not worth the hassle. And then I really dread the number of candidates who clearly lose. There's the margins are large enough. There's no allegations or evidence of wrongdoing or mistakes or anything like that, but who do not accept the outcome, and then that their followers, their supporters, don't accept the outcome. That is something that really, really troubles me. And that will just, pave the way all the way up to 24. We've seen this gradually increase over the last couple of years. President Trump certainly was not the first person to not accept an election outcome when the evidence wasn't there. But when the President of the United States does it and continues to do it over a year later, it just changes the game entirely.
So as you discussed, Trey, we're seeing this rash of election officials being attacked, physically threatened, criminal charges brought against them for doing their job. What do you say to people out there who are either thinking about becoming an election official or thinking about not becoming an election official? What do you say to them to get them to step up and do this important job?
Well, I think I'd remind them, the pay is great, the hours are nice, the benefits are awesome right now. That's not a winning message. I think it is reminding them and selling folks on the critical nature of our elections to the functioning of our country. At the end of the day, making sure we have a well-functioning system of elections, that we know who is supposed to govern, that those are the people who the voters express the will that those govern, is critically important, and we can't do it without you. So there's kind of this combination of patriotism and service. But then the only way we're going to be able to sell that is if the rest of us focus on making sure that good policies are enacted, but that we also backstop. So I'm proud that, during the introduction, you mentioned the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and we partner with Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg, two of the most prominent election lawyers in the country, one a Democrat, one a Republican. I worked with them on President Obama's post-2012 election commission. And we've come together to offer free legal assistance to anybody who needs an attorney. We shouldn't have to do this, but these are the kinds of band-aids that we're going to need to get through the system. But I think this, selling them on the need, the importance, the service is critically important. And yeah, if we could increase poll worker pay and administrator pay and all those kinds of things, that would help as well. I didn't mean to belittle that at the beginning, but I think it's more than that to get these folks to remain involved and to get new folks involved.
Thank you. And say, Georgia is ground zero for a lot of things. What new or innovative things are happening on the ground in Georgia that advocates and election officials should know about, should maybe look to spread to their state? What's out there? What's coming up?
There are cool and innovative things happening all along the spectrum. Some of them have been in response to this moment that we're in, this current version of the Republican Party that has detached from reality, continuing to challenge the results of the 2020 election, and are responsible for the most trash anti-voting bills that we've seen in the history of Georgia, since we all sort of recognized that all citizens should have access to the ballot. Since then, this is probably the worst attack on our elections because Republicans are trying to take their ball and go home, and they recognize that fewer and fewer people are buying what they're selling, and the only way for them to hold on to power is if they cheat. So in response to that, we've not only built, we have a video game that's coming out this year that's just basic, for the folks that are not actually people who are actually voters, but the folks who were born in 2005, 2006, and have a couple more years before they reach the age of majority. And so we're talking about citizenship and government and the three branches of government and how it works, but in a cool and interesting way. And it's called This Is Not a Game, and I'm very excited about it. And it will be on all of the gaming consoles and in all of the app stores. Secondly, we are building an app that helps us to track wait times at all of Georgia's polling locations. So all 1,600 of our polling locations throughout the state. So creating a dashboard that basically gives us an estimate, and it's going to be really helpful for advocates because despite the fact that we've enjoyed something extraordinary, 2,000 people who volunteered with us in the 9 weeks between the 2020 general election and the 2021 runoffs, that still wasn't enough to cover polling locations throughout early voting and on election day. And so we're using a little bit of artificial intelligence to help us monitor all 1,600 polling locations throughout the entire election season. So we're really proud of that, and I'm excited about that as well. I think thirdly, it's not really innovative. We've definitely done it before. There are tons of volunteer lawyers and law students who come out for election day. But again, because of these new trash laws that have been pushed by the Republican legislature in Georgia, there are 5 new voting crimes that have been added to the books. 2 of them are felonies, 3 of them are misdemeanors. There's also a hotline now where the Secretary of State is encouraging people to give anonymous tips, and then they have basically 3 days to act on it. So anonymous tips if they encounter people who are participating in voter fraud. And so this work to criminalize voting, to inject fear and uncertainty in the process feels new and different in my lifetime. And so the concern is that, there are also 1,000 Georgians that our Secretary of State is investigating for quote unquote voter fraud. And the majority of these people are folks who requested absentee ballots, submitted their absentee ballots, and then never heard and never got confirmation that their ballot was received. So they showed up and tried to vote on election day. And so there are 1,000 Georgians that are currently being criminally investigated for that act. And so we have recruited and are recruiting. We're working with the American Bar Association to do continuing legal education, to offer CLE credits so that we can build out a voting rights criminal defense bar in Georgia. Because not since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed have we needed so many lawyers with expertise at the intersection of criminal law and voting rights law. And that is an urgent need in Georgia, because even if only 10% of the Georgians that are currently being investigated are actually go to have a criminal trial, that's still 100 people. We don't have 100 lawyers in Georgia who are criminal defense lawyers who have expertise with our voting laws. Like, this is new and novel, and in a response to the aggressive attack on the right to vote in this way, we are responding with the American Bar Association, with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, and with other impact litigation outfits to put together to develop this new expertise, or to revive this expertise that had gone dormant since we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So.
Thank you, Ense. I think we're all going to be searching the App Store for that app coming up soon.
Yes.
And Maria Tereza, the Hispanic population is often seen as a monolith, and we know that that's not the case. And the problems that are encountered by the Latino population vary, and the solutions need to vary. So what are a couple of the ways that we can help solve some of the problems that are happening around voting, misinformation, access in the Latino population?
So I think that there's a conversation right now that is, I think, overcomplicating a problem and a concern. And it is very much that, yes, it's absolutely true that the Latino population is not a monolith, that we have, different folks coming from different countries. But I often remind folks that what we see in the Latino community is very much generational, and where are they raised? So I give a very anecdotal example that I was raised in California, in Northern California, at the time that Pete Wilson was rising into power, and he decided that the way he was going to own his power was by promoting and helping pass and champion the original modern day show me your paper laws called Proposition 187. That put me into action. I was in college. I remember coming home that Thanksgiving and having a conversation with my grandmother, my aunts, and my uncle, and convincing them that Proposition 187 was not only terrible news, but that they had to become US citizens, that they had to register, that they had to vote. And just like I was having that conversation, millions of my peers in the API community and in the Latino community were doing just that. Alex Padilla, our now senator, was having that conversation. It mobilized a generation of political activism in California. And up to that point, California was a purple state. But a growing population of Americans realized that their life was in jeopardy. And I don't say that lightly. I remember having really hard conversations with my cousins and my aunts and my uncles, and them feeling the pressure of being brown in California and what that meant, and feeling intimidated and scared. And I say that because my family came from Colombia, and that was my American experience. But if I have a conversation with my cousins who also are from Colombia but ended up in Miami, their worldview is completely different. And they had a very different experience, and they could enjoy being Colombian and American growing up in Miami. And so when we talk about that Latinos are not a monolith, that is absolutely the case, but it really depends on where you grow up. And so at Voto Latino, we focus on 8 battleground states where Latinos are coming of age at really fast clips. In Georgia, Latino youth are a larger percentage points of the Latino voting bloc than their parents and grandparents. In Nevada, they're larger as well. In Texas, they're about to eclipse older voters. In Arizona, that is the same. And all these states that I mentioned have all had show me your paper types of laws. And so you have a generation of Americans coming of age who start registering, who participate in the electoral process, and they participate because they're trying to safeguard their families. They're trying to keep them safe. The only place that you're not going to see a generation of young Latinos eclipse their older voters, and it's also the only place that has not had show me your paper laws, is Florida. And Florida shows the power of the vote because they're also one of the states that has had a legacy of Cuban Latino participation at the polls. And so when you say that your vote doesn't matter, it absolutely does. And it changes systems. And for the very first time, it was a young rising population in Georgia that met the African-American community, that met the API community, and together were able to change the trajectory of Georgia. And at Voto Latino, we registered 23,000 Georgians who turned out. 10,000 of them were first-time voters. Biden won that election with 11,000 votes. And so when we talk about how do we mobilize the Latino community, we need to talk to them all the time, not as an afterthought. Oftentimes, and I think this is, Ense and I have these conversations, political parties start talking to us when they just need enough of us to go out and vote. And that's a losing strategy. We talk about the disinformation. It's brilliant, sadly, is that they're communicating with our audience and with our community all the time. And then to get the resources at the last minute to counteract it, it's too late. And so when people say, well, yes, the Latino community is a monolith, absolutely, but we don't need to overcomplicate it. We know exactly what we need to do. At Voto Latino, we were lucky enough to have enough resources starting January 1 of 2020 to register voters. We entered the pandemic having registered 80,000 voters. We finished that election cycle having registered 617,000 people, 78% of them who went out and voted. We mobilized 3.9 million people that were low propensity voters, but we were able to do it because we were fortunate enough to have individual donors and individual folks who understood that we couldn't wait until the last 6 weeks of the election, but they invested in us so that we were ready for one of the most hardest moments of American history during an electoral time, during massive civil unrest. And we were able to meet the moment, but because people believed in us enough to invest in us long-term. And that's what needs to happen. It has to be a long-term investment all the time with a constant communication of saying, when you vote, it actually does work.
Thank you so much, Maria Tereza, and thank you all for joining me. I know these types of panels can be a little disheartening. So to those who are watching, these are just 3 of the amazing advocates who are out there on the ground, working with election officials, working with the public, working with grassroots, trying to ensure that the right to vote is protected 2022, 2024, and beyond. So join us in doing the important work of protecting our democracy. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.